Hello everyone, my name is James Rogers and I'm Assistant Professor in War Studies within the Centre for War Studies and the Danish Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm also the co-convener of the BISA War Studies Working Group alongside Dr Patrick Bury. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr Agnes Callamard to our BISA 2021 conference today. Agnes was until recently the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary or arbitrary executions and is now the Secretary General of Amnesty International. I had the honour to work with Agnes and play a small part in her highly impactful UN reports on the assassination of General Soleimani and the tragic shooting down of flight PS 752 in January 2020. While working with Agnes, I was inspired by her drive for the truth, demand for justice, and her relentless quest to uphold human rights. Indeed, Agnes's work is not without its pressures. As her investigation into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi highlights, Agnes works tirelessly to speak truth to power. As such, there is no one better placed to talk to us today about resetting the international system and rebooting international studies. Before I hand over to our keynote, I would just like to reiterate that you are welcome to add your questions into the Q&A function as the event goes on, and I will call on you during the Q&A session to ask those questions. But for now, however, Secretary General Callamard, it is over to you.
Thank you so much, James, Dr. Rogers. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure to be back working with you. And it's a pleasure to be at the British International Studies Association annual conference. It's an honor indeed. And I'm a bit anxious about making such a long speech, so please forgive me. I also need to be very clear from the start that I am not an international studies scholar, let alone someone with an in-depth understanding of the field, its history and richness. So my title is a bit provocative, to reboot international studies. I think please take it with a pinch of salt. It may be a provocation that I thought I should make because, in my opinion, the international system and need resetting. And it seemed to me that if we need to reset the international system, we may need to reboot international studies. So what I hope to do now is to speak of the world as a human rights person like me encounters it, and ask a question that matters to justice on a global scale, in the hope that where these are not already on your agenda, you may nevertheless provide meaning to what we, human rights people, are confronting and witnessing, and by so doing, support the search for robust answers, response, intervention. I think I will not surprise any one of you by beginning my presentation by talking about a world of crisis and upheaval. In my view, ours is a world of large systemic, historical changes, some of which are existentialist in their implication for humankind. I'm going to name what I consider to be the most important one for me in my work. The first is our natural environment. I think the most serious threat confronted right now by our humanity is climate emergency. I'm sure you've had many occasions to discuss greenhouse gas emission and what kind of catastrophic consequences they could induce for us and for the world if we do not manage to cut them at least by half. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees would include 500 million more people suffering a severe reduction in water resources, to just give an example. Yet climate risk continue to be underestimated, encouraging short-sighted decisions that expand investment in carbon-intensive assets, where the opposite should occur. And here I'm quoting actually from a very recent UN report. So that's the first dimension of this systemic historical pressure. The second is the nature of the economic system or capitalism in the 21st century. I'm not going to pretend that I have an historical understanding of capitalism. What I can say from a human rights standpoint is that since the 2008 financial crisis, the economy as experienced by the majority of people has been characterized by rising income inequality, stagnant wages, and the poverty rate on the increase, having fallen more or less for the last 100 years. The restructuring of the international system, which I will talk about later, is resulting into prolonged trade dispute and some form of protectionism. And so the global economy of the 21st century appears to be an economy of harms, low wages, unemployment, privatization, delocalizations. And these developments have direct implications on the issues I monitor and report, on internal and international conflict, on the multiplication of protest, people in the street, that states can only handle increasingly through police and increasing violence. That is a phenomenon that we witness not only in countries such as Myanmar or Iraq, but indeed in democracies such as the UK and France, where not only the behaviors of the police is increasingly violent, but the legal framework is being changed in order to accommodate greater violence on the part of the authority. So the question that I am asking is, what is the future, or what kind of future capitalism do we, can we envision when the social contract, which has accompanied it, has broken down to such an extent? I'm not suggesting that the contract worked for everybody before, but I'm suggesting that based on our work, it has broken down increasingly, and it's really just little pieces of contract that we found here and there. The third historical pressure, systemic globally, is the demographic divide. It's something that is often overlooked, but in my work, again, as a human rights person, as a human rights expert, it is particularly important because many of the victims for whom we work are young people. It's a category that is very elusive. So let me just say anyone below 30, whether victims of police violence, victims of armed groups, members of armed groups committing violence, and so on and so forth. They are young, migrants, refugees, they are the young. And that is also a reflection of the fact that our planet is divided geographically, but also generationally. In other words, there is the rich and old world, where we are now, and there is a poor and young, restless world. A staggering 90% of youth live in the world's lowest and middle income countries. 70 countries today, 70, have populations whose median age are under 25. That division, divide, I don't know how to describe it really, gap, is reflected in migration patterns, it's reflected in civil wars, in conflict, and on the northern side, it's reflected in population turning inwards, building walls, obsessing over security. The fourth pressure that I am confronting in my day-to-day work is the latest industrial revolution. the digital information technology is something that James knows very well. That has been, for the last decade, a major source of instability, and I have absolutely no doubt that this degree of instability in relation with that revolution is going to increase. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cloning, robotics have far-reaching implications, which I think we are not even equipped to understand. Implications for humans, for human society, which are likely to be extraordinarily complex and severe. In fact, I have no doubt that it is also going to transform what it means to be human. And I will argue in the later part of this presentation that it is already impacting on what it means to be human. So these are the four, I will describe them as historical pressure that I map out when I think of the human rights context of today. There may be other, we could talk about gender, about sexuality and so on, and I will return to them later on. But at a meta level, I tend to see these forces as beginning way before our time and going on way before our time as well. They are with us, and they are taking hold in a context characterized by, first, the reshaping of the international system. I see that reshaping as being much more historically constrained as compared to the four forces I've already described. That's why I'm distinguishing. What do I mean here? I mean basically moving from a system dominated by one single power which exercised hegemonic power to a system of conflict between at least two superpowers and a third, in that case Russia, disrupting what's happening. So the US and China are vying for hegemony. There is Russia that is disrupting, and a couple of regional would-be king. The implications are present all around us: trade war, conflict over influence, proxy conflict, multiplication of hotspots such as South China Sea and Taiwan, armament race, a very important dynamic of our era, space race, control over the remaining spaces upon which national sovereignty has not necessarily well inscribed itself. Frozen part of the earth, the bottom of the ocean, the moon, the planet. These are the new colonization, that we will be witnessing. So that's one of these more constrained, historically speaking, change that is also part of the world of upheaval I am encountering. Another dynamic is that of pandemic. As COVID-19 is lingering, mutating, exposing our vulnerabilities, experts around the world are warning that this is unlikely to be a one-off event, that we may not see the end of it as early as we're expecting. And indeed, in Great Britain, we know that the Delta variant is going through the roof. This deadly virus was made lethal killer by our human ecology. Whatever will be proven to be its precise genesis, COVID-19 flourished in part thanks to our global milieu. Deeper, broader inequality made far worse by post-financial crisis austerity policies that weakened public infrastructure, public health system, international architecture enfeebled in form, function, and leadership, made far worse under pressure from leaders of state who assert archaic construct of state sovereignty and peddle rejectionist approach to science, evidence, and universal norms. Indeed, and this is the third, whether it is maybe more historical than the other two, I don't know. The third element that we are witnessing all around us is the ideological component of those upheavals, the normative component, which may be seen as their foundation. Our era is characterized by repeated attacks against the international system, international global rules, against the idea of human rights and global norms. We have seen an unraveling of the so-called global project and its associated multilateralism. States may tend to move in and out of a national sovereignty focus, depending on their interest, rejecting international scrutiny on some of their behaviors, demanding international cooperation for other matters. That is also reflected in the rising so-called populist politics, strong-arm masculinist leadership, the debates waging across national politics in all regions, and that in fact multilateral negotiation in all forms about gender, sexuality, abortion, contraception, sex education, but also migration, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of which are the object of contestation in terms of what they mean, in terms of who define them, in terms of who own them, in terms of who can speak to them or about them. Everything at the moment, every one of those terms, every one of the experience behind those terms is contested, including true denial of their existence. So this, to me, is the world that I live in as a human rights activist. It's a world of upheaval, it's a world of crisis. It is the equivalent maybe of an earthquake of force 10 in our human history scale. On the other hand, to describe our world as one of crisis and upheaval may not be saying so much, or is not saying enough. Had I been born in Colombia or South Africa or Iraq or Syria or the former Yugoslavia, the preceding decades maybe would have looked worse, one upheaval and disaster after another. So in our analysis of what we encounter, of what we must resist and what we must engage, standpoint matters too. And I need to be very clear, this is my standpoint as a human rights activist living now in the United Kingdom, a privileged person by all global standards you want to use. And I think standpoint matters enormously. We may not yet extrapolate all that how it matters, but I think I just want to be very clear about the fact that the world that I see is taken from my standpoint. I cannot make any claims of a universal standpoint. I will not make any claims of universal standpoint, even though I do make claims that we have universal rights, but that's a different matter, and I'm happy to come back to that. So when I zoom a bit more through all those forces that I have described as a human rights activist living in the UK, woman, middle age, and so on, what do I do as well? What do I see? I see a world of life and death. And within a more conceptual lenses, I will use necropolitics or biopolitics as the framework to make sense of this world. That's how I make sense of it. But I'm very much looking forward to you maybe contesting that framework. It's a world, this world of change is about life and death along a spectrum, not in a binary form. I think this 21st century world is a world of radically changing biopolitics and necropolitics. It's taking old and familiar themes, but giving them sharper edge. COVID-19 has placed this inextricable intertwined politics of life and death scale under harsh light and on a planetary scale, but the issues it exposes and the mode of international governance underlying its management preceded the COVID crisis and is also materialized in a range of other situations or context. I'm not going to go into explaining necropolitics or biopolitics. I think you probably have a sense of what I mean, but I can return to the theory of the Walking Dead and on the place of racism. But all of these matters. Life is governed, and life and death and the political rationality that underpins those, the intervention against those who deviate from a certain norm, those who pose a threat to a biological heritage, to national sovereignty, or increasingly, in fact, to security. That is part of my understanding of biopolitics, underpinned as well or expanded through a non-binary notion of life and death, as Mbebe has pointed out. Contemporary forms of subjugation locate different bodies differently on a spectrum of life and death. Racism is a thread throughout that construction and management of human life. It's institutional racism, it's nano-racism, but it is reflected in all aspects of global politics. And in my view, it is reflected in all of those forces. In other words, all of those long-term forces that I have highlighted and the more shorter ones in terms of historicity, in my view, could be analyzed through a focus on the bio and necropolitics. But what I would like to do now is maybe give some examples that are more current on how these lenses allow me to understand some of the work and some of the violence I confront. The first one will be very familiar to James. It has become a fairly common, not massive necessarily in terms of the victims yet, but common characteristics of the global system we live in. It's so-called targeted killings, extraterritorial in general, meaning a state is targeting an individual or a group of individuals outside their country, and to do so, they usually rely on technology such as drones technology. As James and I have argued in one of my reports, we are in the midst of the so-called second drone age. It is here and it is very menacing. The implications of the use of that technology, the multiplication of the use of that technology is a low intensity conflict drawn out with few, if any, geographical or temporal boundaries. Drones offer unprecedented asymmetrical risk in favor of their deployer. They promise limited damage beyond the target with low to no risk of direct or collateral damage for the initiator. they engender what Philip Alston famously referred to as a PlayStation mentality or a cavalier attitude to killings, although there are some differences of opinion over that. These technologies have been perceived by some as largely bloodless, painless, and odorless, the guarantors of so-called virtuous war. At the cyborg heart of virtuous war is a technical capability and ethical imperative to threaten and actualize violence from a distance with virtually no casualties on the side of the attacker. Okay, so there is a physical and perceived moral and political distance between the attacker and the target, foreign or domestic. Transforming war making, historically a hard choice to make, into an inconsequential political decision. Conflict then becomes a security resource capable of being invoked at any time at a low cost in any remote part of the planet. Drone technology ensures that the means become ordinary in the quotidian course of politics. I'm citing here. Yet, as we have explored, at least in my work and James too, armed drone salures largely rely on hidden and secret casualties, undermining of human rights, certainly, and even democratic principle. There are grave legal implications, internationally and domestically, of these as yet largely unregulated deployment of armed drones. And while they may eliminate risk for their operators, the same certainly cannot be said for those on the ground. The other dimension of those targeted killings through drones is that they are a getaway technology, as quoting your chair here, that open the door to emergent weaponized artificial intelligence, algorithmic robotic warfare, drone swarms, and an overall loosening of humane control over the deployment of lethal force. This is what the current drones are telling us. Today's armed drones are tomorrow's killer robots, and they may even be with us already. There were allegations that killer robots were used in Libya, I believe. Some experts, in fact, argue that those killer robots are well underway and that it is a simple matter of time before autonomous engagement of targets are present on the battlefield. A number of countries are supposedly already developing systems with the capacity to take us, a human being, sorry, my French accent, out of the lethal decision-making loop. As automation increases, the framework for and the meaning of responsibility becomes increasingly blurred. Who is responsible if a robot kills civilians in application of the law? What level of supervision does a human need to exercise over a robot in order to be responsible for its action? Are circumstances conceivable in which robots could legitimately be programmed to act in violation of the law? Could they be programmed to automatically override instruction that they may consider to be against their own judgment? Are there situations in which it would be appropriate to conclude that no individual should be held accountable, despite the fact that unlawful actions may have led to death, civilians and others? what the drones are telling us is multifold, and many I've done a number of studies about it, but I want to highlight a few of them. First, as I pointed out, they are the gateway. They are opening the door. They are announcing what may be already on us, and we may not be aware of it. They are announcing the autonomous weapon. In other words, killings that would take place without human intervention. Drones are also the demonstration that weapons drive the transformation of the legal framework, the transformation indeed of the political framework. The use of drones have meant that a number of states, a minority, but because they are so influential, their position is almost now considered as the principal one. The use of drones have resulted into a transformation of the law of self-defense internationally. It has led to the creation of the concept of preemptive self-defense, invoked against perceived security threat by non-state actors, and indeed now by state actors. Now, I'm not suggesting that if the drone did not exist, we would not have seen those expansion. I don't know. But what is clear is that the existence of the drone has permitted states to act in ways which have then led to or demanded a rethinking of the legal framework somehow to justify the use of drones for the purpose of killings extraterritorially. That expansion of the legal framework is based on three distortions: a distortion of time, in that now states can target individuals or groups outside an imminent threat. So it's no longer, imminence is no longer a temporal criteria. The second distortion is that of geography, in that states can target armed groups anywhere, even in non-belligerent countries. And it has led to a third distortion, which is that of sovereignty. In other words, a state can target somebody in a different state, even if that different state has said no to the targeting. In January 2020, as James knows, because we worked on that together, these kind of legal distortions, which until now had been applied to non-state actors, to armed groups, to so-called terrorist groups, was expanded and applied to a state actor, in this case, an actor working for Iran. And in other words, here we have moved from a very disturbing legal situation, and of course, humane situation, to one where the world felt at the brink of a major conflict. So those incidents and those developments are tragic in their implications for human life and for our international system. But this very international system, here I talk much more about the United Nations, has been made complicit of these necropolitics of life and death. This is reflected, among other things, in the non-working of the UN Security Council, in the non-debate which accompany the use of force extraterritorially, whether it is by the US, by France, by the UK, or indeed by Russia. Adding insult to injury, some may say, the manufactured silence is then constructed as condoning or tacit approval, or as the absence of rejection. So the political working of the system is made hostage some will say willingly, of the global necropolitics of through the use of drones. War, through those development, is normalized as a legitimate and necessary companion to peace, not as its opposite that we should resist. Killings are sanitized, for some actors at least, remaining ever so bloody for the vast majority. But with the development of autonomous weapons, the act of killing is removed from the human act, while the fact of dying remains not. Our analog perspective on killings, on life and death, in my view, is thrown upside down, or will be thrown upside down very shortly. These weapons and the reshaping of the international legal framework and the non-functioning of the international political system that they have required have far-reaching implications for the world, for the international system, and I will suggest that far more theorization is required to understand how our international political system is taken hostage or made complicit, or indeed, as I will argue, may embody ultimately the necropolitics, including through algorithm. The second example I want to give around life and death is that of death as deterrent. There are killings and unlawful deaths which too many governments gloat about or simply brush off. The death of refugees and migrants, of petty criminals, of drug addicts, of social outcasts. Killing or the likelihood of death has become a deterrence policy and a social cleansing policy in full view of everybody, in full view of the world. Because the victims ultimately are not quite human, or not just quite as human as you or I. That's the subtext of what we are witnessing right now on the shore of our borders, ocean, in the Philippines, in Venezuela, along the US-Mexico borders, in Malaysia, in Bangladesh. Any geographical spaces which should act as an insurmountable barrier for migrants and refugees has become a graveyard. And it is a graveyard that is predicated on the notion that those who are dying are not quite human. In the same way that I have unfortunately witnessed how the victims of police killings in the Philippines, for instance, or in Venezuela, and here I'm talking criminal-related issues, not political ones. Those victims are not quite seen as deserving of living, and their deaths become accepted. The likelihood of death become a deterrent, or government want to act to use that as a deterrent. It doesn't work, by the way, but that's not that's not new. We have centuries of experience to know that, but still, we certainly are living in an era where death as deterrence has become a form of politics. And it is a form of politics that has the approval of the social, of society. The mass killings of refugees and migrants in our countries, at our borders, the patrol of the Mediterranean Sea in many ways to prevent rescue, the mass killings of those living in extreme poverty in the slums area in the Philippines and elsewhere. Those testify to the capacity, willingness of our societies to tolerate the unthinkable, to justify the intolerable, and ultimately to celebrate killings. The third example I want to give is that related to COVID. Because, you know, I think COVID has really brought, you know, in my face, the reality of necropolitics in our system. It has laid bare the devastating consequences of inequality structurally and historically. Make no mistake, while few predicted the global scale of the pandemic, what could have been prevented is a grotesque inequality and ruthless repression that left so many people much more vulnerable to the pandemic's fallout. And it proved to be a killer cocktail. Millions of people have died. For many people in the Western world, the COVID crisis is the first confrontation with mass death since World War II. It is, to borrow from a French historian, the first great tragic experience since 1945. We are confronted with large numbers of this. The United States COVID-related death has exceeded American military casualty figures for all American war from 1917 to the present day, more than 600,000 persons. That's hugely significant. And yet, if you were in the US now, it's very striking, the eagerness, enthusiasm with which people are prepared to turn the page and move on and go back in many ways, return to who we were and move on and forget that episode of tragic death. Victims were found disproportionately among the elderly in care home, the homeless, the poor, those with chronic illness, those victims of structural discrimination with least access to services such as African American in the United States, those in detention, but also middle class were struck by COVID because their access to emergency services, their access to respiratory machine was severely curtailed due to years, decades of non-investment in public health, due to years and decades of austerity measures, which have ravaged public health system and public services around the globe. The pandemic has cast a harsh light on the world's inability to cooperate as well in times of dire global needs. You know, throughout 2020, I think every UN official tried to instill in global leaders a sense of global responsibility, but it's quite the opposite that occurred. That was highlighted by President Trump's refusal to participate in the WHO COVAX initiative. It was reflected in the Chinese government censoring and persecution of health workers and journalists. All of these and many more were an egregious affront to international cooperation. So our challenge as we move beyond the immediate grip of COVID is not merely that of recovery. It must be about reset and reboot. It should be about laying the grounds for a post-pandemic world that remembers those on the front line, that remembers those who died and why they died. A world where infinite greed no longer bulge out the pocket of billionaires, of corporations, of corrupt civilian and military leaders alike, leaving public systems for health education, livelihood crumbling as the planet teeters on devastation. But come 2021, and what do we witness? But if not more or less the same behaviors than we saw in the years preceding COVID and in the year during COVID. Multilateral institutions enfeebled as powerful member states consistently continue to promote self-interest over global solidarity. How else to describe the hoarding of vaccines by rich countries and the failure of their state and the pharmaceutical companies to share the knowledge and the technology to expand global vaccine supply? While some countries are now vaccinating 12 years old and lifting restrictions around the pandemics, others have yet to vaccinate a single health worker. The United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada have already vaccinated the majority of their population with at least a single dose. The UK and the US have fully vaccinated 2/5 of their population. Yet, the poorest countries on current trend will reach full vaccination in 57 years, in the year 2078. Of course, the world would have moved on by then, but it's just, I think, to reflect where we are at in 2021. Having gone through 2020, having seen the world on its knee in 2020, what do we do in 2021? We continue, we proceed in the same way. I have here an example of Bolivia and what is their current situation, but I will pass on that because I think I've spoken long enough. Just to say that the examples of countries begging for vaccines and the example of countries refusing to open the license are ripe around the world, everywhere. And this, because we are in Great Britain, because we are part of the privileged population, many of us have been vaccinated, that, dear friend, is done also in our name. So, in conclusion, those examples, and the state of the world more generally, as I have highlighted earlier, global politics around life and death, in my view, serve to illustrate the notion that the international system has necropolitics built into it. That is reflected in when it intervenes, who it rescues and saves, and who it does not, who it defines as victim and who it ignores, whose lives are celebrated and whose lives are ignored, whose life matters and whose does not, who deserves state protection and who does not, who warrants sustenance and care on which human dignity depends, and who is by contrast expendable, who is to be held sacred and sacrosanct, and who is to be hunted down, whose death is to be grieved and whose is to pass us by unnoticed. The international system responds to all those questions. It determines that some bodies, some humans, some people are more grievable than others. In that system, life and death are not just binary state, as Achille Mbembe pointed out in his 2003, so almost 20 years ago report. It's not simply an on and off switch. In my research on mass graves, I wrote about how our rights linger beyond death, being held vicariously in the hands of those who mourn us, and in how our death are memorialized. But death seeps its way into life too. In 1999, judges of the Inter-American Commission argued in the landmark decision of Street Children versus Guatemala that in essence, The fundamental right to life includes not only the right of every human being not to be deprived of his or her life arbitrarily, but also the right that he or she will not be prevented from having access to the conditions that guarantee a dignified existence. The arbitrary deprivation of life is thus not limited to the illicit act of homicide. It extends itself likewise to the deprivation of the right to live with dignity. The world around us peels back our indifference to expose our life in conditions of material deprivation, of extreme poverty, as targets of bigotry and hatred, cause people to live not below a poverty line, but below a lifeline. Our subjugations locate bodies differently along a spectrum of life to death, even in life. That's what Mbembe was saying in 2003. In 2021, increasing masses of individuals have been governed through their direct and indirect exposure to life in indignity and to death without dignity. This exposure is legislated upon, governed upon by an international system which dictates who may live and who must die, who may be protected and named and who cannot. What we may describe as a weakness and ineffectiveness of our international system may well be, in fact, the drivers of the global politics of necropolitics, the necessary mechanisms of a system which needs death, mass death, to survive, a system which requires denying those deaths, denying those humanities through a myriad ways called racism, sexism, imprinted upon security and sovereignty. Those two, as global or globalizing values of our era, have less to do with territory and more to do with who is desired, admired, who is to be protected as compared to those who are to be rejected, resiled, targeted. Those choices are a powerful determinant of the global social order, not only because as human bodies we are vulnerable, but because of the fundamental precariousness too of our existence. What will it take to reset this international system? Are we heading towards another major conflagration of hatred and wars and massive death? Because that to me will be almost the logical implications of everything that I am witnessing. In this present, which is both challenging and frightening, much more is asked of us in the now. It requires the best of our knowledge, the most courageous of our effort to stay true to the values which can counter or break this downward journey. To change the path, we need guide stars. That, in my view, is what human rights provide. But to chart the course, we need strong maps, sturdy vehicles, excellent analysis of the terrain as it unfolds in front of us. And for that, I look to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Just as people start to populate the Q&A with their questions, I will continue where you have just left off. You've said that you look to us, but right now we are looking to you as Keynote. And I very much welcomed your broad, holistic approach, where you tie together issues like drone warfare and mass graves, climate change and COVID under an umbrella of systemic historical challenges. Could we take your keynote as a call for us to look outside our disciplinary silos in academia and more readily embrace cross-subject cooperation, cooperation with policy and think tanks such as your own, and interdisciplinary study. Is that the reboot that we need?
Thank you, James. What do you think? Is that the reboot that we need? I think it is part of the reboot that's needed, but I wonder too whether we don't need to reimagine what international means and to reset our location and our, you know, the element of that system. Myself, I do not quite understand how those historical systemic forces, which began several decades, if not century ago, and keep going now, climate change and so on, how together they interact with the more current challenges that we confront. I look to people in international studies to give me both an international and an historical perspective on how the system need to evolve if we are to avoid a conflagration of the kind that the necropolitics seems to be heading us towards. You know, I'm also looking for solutions, not wrapped up as solution, but a way of understanding and making sense of what's happening, which would give me the clues for how I need to intervene at my level. So it is interdisciplinary, but it is also historical. It is, integrating a range of pressures and forces, but not being overwhelmed by it. Telling us maybe what matters less.
Well, we've got some questions in the chat now. So could I invite, bear with me, Ruth Blakely to ask her question first.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Agnes, for your reflections. My question is about the fact that human rights defenders, yourself and many others included, are themselves under considerable threat. And that's obviously worse on the ground in more challenging countries. So I wondered what you would say are the best ways that as academics, but also perhaps as activist academics, as some of us are, what are the routes by which we can hold powerful global North governments to account to protect and support that urgent work that you're doing to promote human rights for all? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm very grateful for your questions and for your interest. I'm going to answer in three, probably four different ways. The first is that I would like to acknowledge the fact that academics, in my view, may be on the next, or they are already in a number of countries, are already targeted. So I'm very glad that you are an activist. I just want to highlight the fact that in human rights terms, the freedom to teach, the academic freedom is under threat around the world. It's reflected in direct attacks against scholars. It's reflected in the fact that truth, methodology, certain form of research, i.e. gender, Islamophobia, a number of individuals are being targeted by various actors for the work that they undertake, for the teaching that they want to do, for the writing that they are making. Academics may be, the academic institution may be the next frontier where freedom of expression, freedom to know, freedom of information, the notion of truth are going to be fought. So I just want to highlight that. I think it's a crucial component of the human rights we should be prepared to defend. Now, in terms of your direct contribution and involvement, therefore, of course, one of them is very clearly to continue to work and to argue and to fight for truth, for science, for academic freedom, even within your own context. I think it's extraordinarily important for academic institutions which can afford to stand for those values to continue to do so, and to do so in a much more strident way than they may have done before, because it is under threat in so many parts of the world. So that's my first recommendations. As you probably know, there are more practically already a range of initiatives, such as that around scholars in exile, for instance, which provides assistance to scholars who are fleeing their countries because they are being targeted for the research they do. Academics can support the work of human rights defenders by inviting them, by providing a safe haven, by becoming members of organizations such as Amnesty International, by making sense of the world we live in, by condemning governments' behaviors when these behaviors are violating human rights. You know, academics have a legitimacy and still do, in spite of the attacks. I think maybe that's why they are now being attacked. Their role in society confer them an authority which can be extremely important in situations where rights are disputed, where values are contested, and speaking up. The articulation of positions that are value-driven by academics has huge implications for society, and far more than when I do it, because I'm seen as the usual suspect. So, speaking up, standing up, including against one's own authority or government, is all part of the role of academics in protecting human rights and protecting human rights defenders anywhere.
Thank you, Agnes. I've been asked to ask a question on behalf of Julia Welland, and it's based on your own personal journey into human rights activism. What animated you in the first place, and how do you retain your energy? It seems like a boundless energy when faced with many challenges that you outlined for us earlier.
My drive is really derived from the people I work with and the people I work for. It's I get inspired by human rights defenders, by my colleagues at Amnesty International, by scholars I work with when I explore a new theme. I get inspired by stories that I'm reading, and I get angered by the injustice, and that's a formidable driver for me. Not that I am angry. In fact, I'm not very, very angry, but I am. Anger is a feeling that I do not reject, because I think it can be. It can become a force for good. You know, the determination to respond and to do that in a more methodical way, in a more thought out way. That is certainly what drives me. My personal history, my family, all of whom have had something to do and something to say for social justice. I think my love for people, ultimately, my love for their courage, my rejection, my deep-seated rejection of injustice, and that are formidable forces, I think, for me and for many others. So I don't know where I get the energy from. I don't know whether I have more energy. I'm not sure, but everything I do, most of my day are full of inspiring moments. And I think, that certainly keeps me going.
Well, you are certainly an inspiration to me, and I'm sure not the only person in the room to say that. Karen Smith has said, thank you for your powerful speech. It serves as a stark reminder to us as IR scholars that our field does, could, and should concern itself with matters of life and death, and to think about the teaching and research work that we do on a daily basis in that light. And that actually leads me on to a question that I'd like to ask you. Could you return to and explain the theory of the walking dead you mentioned and your perception of necropolitics as your view of the world? Because it fascinates me that this is the way in which you see the world. Is it based on your extensive policy experience? Because helping us to understand that may also help us to reboot our way of thinking about these challenges in international studies.
Oh, this is such a difficult question, James. And why let me ask you, let us have a bit more of a discussion than a question answer work. I mean, you are an historian of armament, of weapons, and I know you focus on weapons, but that surely has led you to reflect on against whom those weapons are used, by whom, and what they do. In your understanding of the world, don't you think that that the determination of who lives and dies, the determination of the politics around the use of weapons, the existence or not of a regime to regulate these weapons, isn't there in those global policies a reconstruction and an understanding of life and death? If we look at why isn't there a second, why aren't we regulating drones? I mean, we all know what's going on here. Why do you think governments are yet not prepared, even though the risk of non-state actors and other states grabbing hold of that technology are there? It's a very easy technology in many ways. Why?
So you've fired an easy question back at me. Thank you, Agnes. I'll answer that within 2 seconds, of course. No, I think it is a really important question. And from our discussions previously and our work and my own work on this, and actually just listening to you today and what I understood your focus on necropolitics to be about, I see drones as a lens through which we can analyze a number of disturbing issues within international politics. And one of those for me is an erosion of the right to life at an international level. And I wonder the extent to which we make assassinations permissible within the international system, be they of non-state actors and thus seen as legitimate killings, or perhaps even increasingly of state actors being seen as legitimate killings. That has a ripple effect, a butterfly effect, that overall creates a permissible environment in which it is okay to kill anyone within that very broad, malleable remit. And one thing that this has got me thinking about within our current moment of crisis and disaster is whether or not COVID-19 and the mass amount of death around the world has either created has either entrenched this perception of mortality, where death is just something that is part of the unfair nature of life and death, or whether or not this could be a moment of hope in which we place increasing value on human life. And you start to see this across the board, and it creates its own ripple effect, to which we create a new understanding of human life as being the fundamental thing within our humanity to uphold and safeguard. And that, of course, ties back to mass killings, arbitrary killings, extrajudicial assassinations, and killings by drones. Do you think we're in that moment of hope? Am I too ambitious?
No, but exactly. I think the point you're making is very central to what I was trying to say. Maybe not as well as you did. It should. 2020 should have been a revealing moment for us all, for global leaders, for people at all levels of society. It should have shown the sanctity of life and how the policy we are following are actually undermining that value. And, I've highlighted the austerity measures, the lack of investment, basic things such as emergency equipment, face mask, now vaccine. And, nothing of these 3-something million dead, none of them seem to have had that impact on our ability to recenter politics on the protection of life. It's mind-boggling to me, I must be honest. I'm just, I'm even more astonished by 2021 than I was by 2020. Because 2020 is a pandemic. Yeah, we never really experienced it. And but in 2021, that we could continue, we could proceed as if there were no learning from 2020, except that we can work remotely. Basically, that's what 2020 is going to be reduced to, or so it seems. A new understanding of work-life balance and, remote working arrangement. It's scary. So I personally, because of my work, I have seen not one single moment so far where there is a reckoning with the centrality and the vulnerability of life. I haven't seen that. I have seen a global society really keen and eager to move on, to return, but not to change or not to learn. So, if you have seen a change, let me know where.
Well, you paint a disquieting but not demoralizing picture of our current state of society and the future. If anything, it is a call for us all to rise up and to use our voices to show the change that we want and need in society over the coming years and decades, and to reconcile these historic fractures that you mentioned. And it is all the more possible as you are now with us in London as part of, as Secretary General of Amnesty, and we all very much look forward to working with you as part of BISA and Amnesty over the coming years. I will draw the session to a close here, and thank you again, Secretary General Callamard, and all of you for your time and for your fantastic questions. Please do get in contact with us at BISA War Studies. You can follow us on Twitter at BISA War Studies, and do attend our events into the future. Thank you, Agnes.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.